Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Osijo. I'm the director of the International Migration Studies MA program and also associate professor of sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. And thank you for joining us today. This is the latest event in our immigrant seminar series, the sixth that we're holding this semester, second to last. Thank you to Professor Van Tran for co-organizing this series with me and with IMS. And we have a treat for you this week. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I just want to let you all know we're recording today's talk for public promotion, so please mute yourselves. We'll have a Q&A after the talk, which I will moderate. And if anyone has any questions or comments, you may reserve them for then, or feel free to either place them in the chat or just indicate in the chat that you have one. So now for those of you who follow who the stars of sociology are these days, our speaker today needs no introduction, but if you don't, and I really think you should, I will provide a little bio. So Jean Beaman, our speaker today, is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She was previously on the faculty at Purdue University and has held visiting positions, fellowships at Duke University and the European University Institute located in Florence, Italy. Her research is ethnographic in nature and focuses on race, ethnicity, racism, international migration, and state-sponsored violence in both France and the United States. She is author of Citizen Outsider, Children of North African Immigrants in France, which was published in 2017 by University of California Press, an ethnographic examination of children of immigrants, marginalization, cultural citizenship, and racism in France, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. Her current book project focuses on police violence against and hyper-surveillance of racial and ethnic minorities and anti-racist mobilization in France, and how that compares to other societies. Finally, she is also an editor of HNet Black Europe, an associate editor of the journal Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power, corresponding editor for the journal Metropolitan, and soon to be, this is the best position, deputy editor of City and Community. Now, every second I spend talking just delays the start of the show. So without further ado, I welcome the incomparable Jean Beaman.
Oh my God. Thank you so much, Rich. I'll give some feedback on that intro later. So thanks so much. Really excited to be here, to be with old friends, new friends, be virtually here. I was going to have my Zoom background be the beach, but I didn't want to sort of, kind of tease you anymore. But anyway, but it's a beautiful day today. Okay, so I'll just dive right into it. So the title of my talk is Suspect Citizenship, Race and Racism in Contemporary France. And what I thought I would do is sort of briefly talk about my first book, Citizen Outsider, and then talk about how my work is and my thinking has sort of progressed since that point. So the main question of my research agenda is, how do citizens remain on the margins of mainstream society? And what does this reveal, or what can we learn about how race and ethnicity operate in practice? So as I'm an ethnographer, I'm going to start with a brief story about Sophia, who's a 39-year-old that I met over a decade ago. Okay. So Sophia says, quote, "I remember working really hard in school because I really wanted to escape my social background. I didn't want to be as poor as my parents or mistreated, because when you don't know French perfectly well or have a certain level of education, especially when you're an immigrant, that's what happens. So I said to myself that when I grow up, it's out of the question to be treated like that. And I also worked hard because I wanted to earn a lot of money to help my parents, to have my parents be proud of me. So there's a bit of social retaliation there," end quote. So this only intensified as she grew older. As a law student, she remembers classmates telling her, or calling her, a quote unquote dirty Arab, and telling her she should return to her country. However, she managed to be successful in her studies, earning both undergraduate and graduate degrees. She now works as a journalist and is also a novelist, and rents an apartment in Cergy-Pontoise, which is a western banlieue or suburb of Paris, with her two young children and her husband, who was born to Algerian immigrant parents and works as a banker. There is much that makes her proud to be French, as those values exemplified in the motto of liberté, égalité, fraternité. But she hates that her identity as a French person is often questioned by others. Quote, today when I'm with my children, people still ask me, what are your children's origins? Or where do you come from? That drives me crazy because my children were born in France to French parents. And me, I was born here. My children were born here and they still ask me that. It's so annoying to have to continually justify myself based on the color of my skin or the color of my children's skin, end quote. So Sophia feels that her place in France is challenged because she is French or Maghreb origin. Reflecting on her status in French society, she feels that she is quote unquote French in the second degree. Despite her middle class status and educational and professional accomplishments, she nonetheless feels that she occupies a France that continually reminds her of how her ethnic origin excludes her from being accepted as French as anyone else. So in a later conversation, she described her recounting a disturbing incident. So one day, this is a few years ago, she was traveling to Marseille in the south of France by train for some work-related meetings. She had no luggage with her since she was not spending the night and had only her work bag or satchel with her. When her train arrived at Gare de Lyon in Paris at the end of the day, she was stopped leaving the train by a plainclothes police officer. He demanded to see what was inside her bag. She explained that he tutoyed her or addressed her using the informal tu versus the formal vous form. Sophia was offended that he did not immediately identify himself as a police officer, nor use the formal vous form for you when addressing her. He demanded to see her identification and asked her why she had only a work bag with her. Quote, are you smuggling drugs? The officer asked. Are you a prostitute? Are you working for someone? End quote. Humiliated, Sophia explained that she was a journalist who went to Marseille for some meetings and showed her personal identification and the identification indicating the publication for which she works. Quote, the craziest thing she explained to me as her eyes welled up with tears was that the train was packed with people, with white people. There were a ton of white people, and I was the only one stopped, and no one said anything. The other passengers just stared at me, end quote. So she's currently pursuing legal means to address this incident, which as she explained to me, she's seen happen to way too many racial and ethnic minorities in France. Quote, you can't just let these things go by. How can people not think this is wrong? So Sophia is one of the adult children of North African immigrants I discussed in my book, Citizen Outsider, pictured here, published in 2017. So based on ethnographic research and interviews with 45 adult children of Maghreban or North African immigrants, I discussed the intersections of race, ethnicity, and societal belonging in French society. I specifically focus on the middle class segment of the second generation population and demonstrate how they are denied cultural citizenship, which would allow them to be accepted as French by others, solely because they're non-white. So this framework of citizen outsiders is a term I borrow from political scientist Kathy Cohen, who uses it to characterize both the precarious social locations of Black American youth. This is a framework that's rooted in work by scholars, including Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, and Patricia Hill Collins, who have conceptualized how individuals can be members of a society, yet simultaneously kept on the margins of that society, thereby complicating the relationship between race, citizenship, and societal belonging. So the middle class North African second generation is both inside and outside of society. They have made it, so to speak, but only to a point, as they are continually reminded of how their citizenship and belonging are quote unquote suspect and often questioned by others. These citizen outsiders are suspect at both micro and macro levels, from having their identity routinely checked by the police in public spaces, like in Contrôle d'identité, or like what Sophia experienced earlier, to growing up with fewer representations of North African or Maghreb origin individuals in government or popular culture. So to clarify terms, I use in this talk, I use the terms North African and Maghreb interchangeably. Following the leads of my respondents, I also use the term white throughout this talk to refer to Français de souche or those of native French European origin, even though I recognize that white is not an officially used term in French society. Yet this is a term that is used by my interlocutors. I also want to add that just as my respondents were citizen outsiders, I too, as a non-French American citizen doing research in France, was an outsider. Yet in some ways, my identity as a Black American woman created an insider connection with some of my respondents because they also perceive me as a racial and ethnic minority, and I identify that way. My own race and identity were therefore directly implicated in conducting this research. And to me, this further reveals the different ways that race manifests itself within French society through the connections that my respondents make. So why France, which is a question I get often. So France is a fascinating site of analysis of these questions because of its continued disavowal of race and ethnicity as exemplified in French Republican ideology. So simply put, French Republicanism emphasizes the relationship between individuals and the state over any other group categorization or identity. Being French is supposed to supersede any other identification, be it linguistic, regional, or ethnic. Race, as well as ethnicity, is not considered a legitimate category by the state. It is not measured in the French census. France, therefore, continually reminds itself and reminds itself as colorblind or race neutral. Yet, despite the Republican emphasis on the renunciation of such categorization, Frantz Fanon, as well as many scholars of French colonial history in particular, have argued that France has long relied on racial and ethnic boundaries in constructing its national identity. Since France has a long history of colonial slavery, colonialism, and related subsequent migration, it is therefore necessary to understand how individuals who are descendants of these structures fare today. I use the framework of cultural citizenship as a corrective to theories of immigrant incorporation and assimilation for the second generation. Cultural citizenship signifies a claim to belonging that is accepted by others, that would allow an individual to traverse the cultural symbolic boundaries around a particular national identity, or in this case, enable children of North African immigrants to be seen as truly French by others. So cultural citizenship is particularly interesting and relevant in France, as again, citizenship status is something that's supposed to supersede all markers of difference. So simply put, my approach to cultural citizenship here is informed by, among others, legal scholar Letty Vope, who's emphasized how citizenship is automatically constituted by specific cultural values, and anthropologist Renato Rizaldo, who conceives of cultural citizenship as the right to be different without being denied belonging. This approach challenges notions of citizenship as the salient boundary, marking us versus them, as articulated in the work by Brubaker, Lemont, and others. I push this further by demonstrating how the North African second generation is excluded, despite their legal citizenship status. Citizenship status is therefore not the most significant marker of inclusion and exclusion, as children of immigrants experience marginalization similar to that of their immigrant parents solely because they are not white. So my interlocutors are technically part of France, like continually kept on the margins of French society. This exclusion cannot be explained by their socioeconomic status, as they are middle class, well-educated, and hold professional jobs, and are upwardly mobile compared to their immigrant parents. Rather, they are incapable of being seen as French by other French people, solely because they're non-white. Though France promotes an inclusionary national identity through its Republican model, it in fact excludes certain populations despite their citizenship, such as the individuals I discuss here. France therefore has a growing group of citizens who, despite doing everything quote unquote right, cannot be fully included. They're continually unable to have their identity affirmed and acknowledged by others, and therefore remain in a marginal social location. So France's colorblind ideology veils the difficulties facing marginalized individuals solely based on their race and ethnic origin. So here I'm influenced by Frantz Fanon, who in Black Skin, White Mask wrote about how the European has a fixed concept of the quote unquote Negro, and therefore how Blacks in France are never seen as of France. I extended my work, Omi and Winant's framework of the racial project to France. This framework allows me to consider how people are marked as different and inferior without state level categories. It also explains the creation and maintenance of a quote unquote racial common sense, in which individuals are marked as distinct in the absence of state categories, and these distinctions come to have meaningful consequences. I'm also influenced by French scholar Day, who's discussed how Blacks in France are paradoxically and simultaneously visible and invisible. And Trika Keaton, who argues that France's race blindness actually serves to be coupled with race-based assumptions, which lead to a continual consciousness of race. I'm also influenced by the work of David Theo Goldberg's framework of racial Europeanization, or how race is seen as a problem everywhere but in Europe, where it is often framed as exceptional or related to phenomena of the past, such as the Holocaust. He argues that, quote, the idea of the European excludes those historically categorized as non-European, as being non-white. You are here so you don't really or fully belong. Your sojourn is temporary, so don't get you comfortable, end quote. This illustrates, among other things, how race and ethnicity are taboo to discuss, yet as my research shows, omnipresent in the lives of individuals marked as non-white. Racial meanings are still articulated and hierarchies based on these meanings are still applied. So I'm going to provide a few examples from my research of the denial of cultural citizenship due to racial and ethnic origins. So Farid is a 29-year-old of Moroccan origin who lives with his family in the western banlieue of Poissy and feels that his ethnic origin has colored his experiences, excuse the pun there, including his career working at a bank. He remembers one of his colleagues suggesting he change his name to one that is more traditionally French, such as Pierre or Jacques. Here he was encouraged to hide one marker of his difference, his North African sounding name, in order to fit in. It says, quote, they don't want me. They tell me to integrate. Me, I don't want to integrate. I am French. I don't need to integrate. I was born in France. I respect the laws of the Republic, but they still tell us, no, you're not French. You will never be French. They tell us that because our parents have foreign origins and that automatically we do too. We are sometimes obligated to hide our differences as if we are ashamed of them. But I've arrived at an age when I tell myself it's my difference. I'm not looking to put it out front, but I don't want people to tell me to hide it, end quote. So here Farid identifies what many of my respondents reference, which is a sort of impossibility of being seen as a full French citizen. Another example is Nasser, a 29-year-old of Algerian origin and a practicing Muslim who lives in Nanterre, which is a western banlieue of Paris. He says, quote, we are sitting between two chairs. Even though I'm a manager at my company, I drive an expensive car, etc. I can try to go to a club, like a nightclub or something, and cannot get in. And then I return to reality. You are never 100% either way. Maybe I'm asking for too much, wanting to be both 100% Algerian and 100% French, but I can't choose between them. I want to combine the best parts of both into something great, but I don't know, I still feel different, end quote. So Nasser is university educated. He did his undergraduate work in France and his graduate studies in the UK. And he's worked in his company as both an engineer and a technical director. Because of his professional and educational accomplishments, he feels as though he understands the quote unquote codes or sets of behaviors necessary for success in the French workplace and larger French society. However, he's come to realize that his professional success and the cultural capital that comes with it are not enough to prevent him from the same discrimination that less quote unquote successful children of Maghreb immigrants or immigrants themselves experience. Despite his upper mobility vis-a-vis his immigrant parents, his father worked in construction and his mother was a homemaker, and neither of his parents had greater than the equivalent of an elementary school level education. Nasser is not removed from occupying a marginal status in larger French society. Quote, if I'm walking in a bourgeois Parisian neighborhood and an old French lady sees me, she'll cross the street to walk on the other side. I think it's going to take several more generations for people to not see differences like this, for someone to see a Black person or an Arab walk by in the street and not even notice it. Okay, so in this book, I later rest the notion of a French exceptionalism regarding distinctions based on race and ethnicity. The examples of these citizen outsiders reveal how non-white individuals do not get to be French in the sense of having their identity as French accepted by other French people. France, therefore, has a growing group of citizens who, despite doing everything right, cannot be seen as fully belonging. They lack the cultural citizenship to actually be seen as French. This illustrates, among other things, France's racial project, which creates a racial common sense in a seemingly colorblind society. By focusing on middle-class individuals, I demonstrate how being incorporated into French society is not solely a matter of various professional or educational accomplishments. This further reveals how race and ethnicity operate as master categories, shaping, among other things, boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. In other words, race comes to matter because Maghreb-born origin individuals and other racial and ethnic minorities are continually racialized. Even though race and ethnicity are not legitimated by the state because of the Republican ideology, they nonetheless become evident through everyday practices of marginalization and exclusion. Because of these processes of racial formation, non-white immigrant origin individuals will continually be left out of mainstream society, and only a quote unquote partial assimilation would ever be possible. Even though my respondents exemplify what immigrants and their descendants are supposed to do in order to quote unquote fit in, and I mean exemplify based on the Republican model, i.e. work hard, be well educated, hold stable middle class jobs, what is clear is that it's never enough. This is the reality for not just middle class children with African immigrants, but rather all non-white individuals today. So my current work builds off of some of these questions I had when finishing my book, or rapidly trying to get tenure. So to consider sort of how a suspect citizenship or belonging is continually constructed in contemporary French society. So I'm currently conducting ethnographic research on mobilization against police violence against Black and Maghreb origin individuals, which so far has included interviews with activists who are associated with different collectives or organizations, as well as journalists who've reported on some of these issues and family members of victims of police violence, some of whom have become activists themselves. I'm using anti-racist mobilization and activism against police violence and harassment to examine how state violence is one of the mechanisms that is reinforcing a second-class citizenship or a suspect citizenship for these minority populations. In their activism, these minority populations are responding to a state violence that is not new, but rather an extension of the violence of French colonialism, which is then mapped onto the hexagon. So here I'm in conversation with Akim Abi's notion of necropolitics, considering the ways that the state has the capacity to determine who is and who is not disposable, or moreover, who does and who does not belong or can belong. As well as Anna Kurtarag's and Yorki Yurdel's production of non-belonging, Neariolos Davis' notion of the politics of belonging, Paul Silversine's conception of citizenship surveillance through Les Contrôles d'identité of predominantly Black and Maghreb individuals, and Damani Petrich's work on the construction of non-citizens in reunified post-1989 Germany and how they are subject to quote unquote exclusionary incorporation. I'm interested in the ways that individuals are continually kept on the margins of the society and how they mobilize against that. And I am using police violence and anti-racist mobilization as a way to understand that. So the relationship between suspect citizenship and state violence can be seen, for example, in the 2005 uprisings throughout many of France's banlieues or suburbs. Here, Saïd Bena, a 17-year-old of Tunisian origin, and Beno Traoré, a 15-year-old of Malayan origin, pictured here, were electrocuted in a substation as they fled police in Clichy-sous-Bois, a Parisian banlieue. They are apparently trying to avoid the constant contrôle d'identité or identity checks by the police, similar to what I've mentioned earlier. Outrage about their deaths led to uprisings throughout France for about a few weeks. Then President Jacques Chirac declared a state of emergency, and then Interior Minister and later President Nicolas Sarkozy called the individuals involved in the uprisings racailles or scum and suggested cleaning the streets of the banlieues, with a brand of a high-pressure water hose. The police officers involved in the deaths of Saïd and Bena were cleared of all charges 10 years later. These events drew national and international attention to an often ignored segment of the French population, immigrants and descendants of immigrants from former French colonies throughout Africa. These uprisings were also covered in the American media, depicted as a quote unquote other France, bemoaning how France's Republican ideology, which does not acknowledge race and ethnicity as legitimate categories, has failed to work in its incorporation of immigrants and their descendants, or recognize its colonial legacy in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. And this is an image on well, the image of them, and then the image of the poster, but then the one on my top right is from a demonstration of kind of reclaiming the term rakai. So do some two-day rakai, or try to take back or reappropriate this term. Another more recent example is the case of Adama Traoré, a 24-year-old Black construction worker who died under unusual circumstances after being arrested in a banlieue north of Paris in July 2016. The police first claimed that he had died of a sudden heart attack, and then later said he had a severe infection. So also Traoré, pictured here in the middle under a photo of her brother, is his 32-year-old sister and is leading the movement for justice for Adama. Since his death, which one American media account termed quote unquote Francis Ferguson, there have been numerous demonstrations demanding justice for Adama Traoré, including one every year on the anniversary of his death. And this photo is from one such demonstration in 2018. So also his family, and her family, excuse me, are alleging lack of assistance and willful neglect by the police as both contributing to his death, especially since he had no chronic health issues prior to his death. Before her brother's death, Asa was working as a teacher's assistant in a banlieue north of Paris. She has since written 2 books, the tales of which she uses to seek justice for her brother. She has this is her brother, excuse me. This includes paying legal fees for 4 of her other brothers. She has 17 total siblings who have been in jail for various periods since Adama's death. She has stated publicly that her family has been under attack by the state ever since they contested its official explanation for Adama's death. So Asa regularly gives talks about police violence and her brother's death, not just in France, but all over the world, and has received support from various celebrities, including French rapper Maccabi and activist and scholar Angela Davis. As she explained to me when I first met her in summer 2017, she sees this cause as not just about justice for her brother, but for all forgotten populations in France, including residents of les quartiers populaires, or working class neighborhoods, who know the police only as a quote unquote invading force. So once when I met with her when she was signing copies of her first book in the offices of Soul, her publisher in Paris, she explained, quote, "We don't see people like Adama as a human, a son, a brother. Even I've been controlled in these quartiers, neighborhoods. What's happening is France is having an identity crisis. It wants to suppress differences, but you can't do that," end quote. And Alsa's point, I think, also speaks to the tensions inherent in French republicanism, as some differences in French society are seen as meaningful and others are not. And this is a photo from a protest that I was a part of a few years ago. Another way of thinking about this involves the massacre at the editorial offices of Charlie Hebdo, a satirical magazine, in January 2015. So in the aftermath of this massacre, a great deal of attention focused on the slain cartoonists and the columnists, and including the international slogan, "Je suis Charlie." But another slogan soon appeared, recognizing another victim of these attacks, Ahmed Marabey, pictured here. So Marabey was a Muslim police officer of Algerian origin, killed during the attacks while trying to pursue the shooters at the Charlie Hebdo editorial offices in the 11th arrondissement. It was "Je suis Charlie," however, that became the international rallying cry. "Je suis Ahmed" was a far less common sentiment. The central question, therefore, about inclusion and belonging, and who is and who can be the emblematic citizen or a emblematic citizen upholding the core values of French society, hangs in the gap between these 2 slogans. In other words, can someone seen as not French or as not white be the poster child for tolerance, freedom, democracy in contemporary France and Europe more generally? I also like this quote by Auréa Bichara, a French activist of Algerian origin who started the group and political party, Parti des Indigènes de la République. She says, quote, it only takes one generation for an Italian, a Portuguese, or a Pole to become really French, while this dignity will always be in effect denied to the old deported Africans who were made relegated to the hexagon or the dusty corners of the empire. Excuse me. As for the metropolis, it parked them on reservations with their children. Too Arab to be French, too indigenous to be white. Between white people and us, there is race. It is constitutive of this republic. It will always rise between us, end quote. So this exemplifies how, among other things, race continually structures the nation state, even in this post-colonial era. Or rather, as Oria herself refers to it, this neo-colonial reality. This is another way of thinking about the quote-unquote panic of the post-colonial. France's current anxieties about immigrants, multiculturalism, or Islam, especially this week actually, need to be properly situated in its colonial context, specifically thinking about the Maghreb, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Asia and the Caribbean. This should move us beyond a solely immigrant-focused lens to grappling with how actual citizens are marginalized across French society as well as Europe, solely because of their race and ethnic origin. This quote also gets at how race and racism continually structure who can belong and whose belonging in societal membership is always suspect. Of course, we can and should think about these questions of suspect belonging outside of France. So consider the juxtaposition of images of Alan Kurdi here, the 3-year-old drowned Syrian refugee found on the shore of Turkey trying to reach Greece in 2015. So lots of 2015 references in this talk. With the Charlie Hebdo cartoon depicting 2 men chasing 2 terrified women with a caption, "What would little Alan have grown up to be?" and then answered at the bottom, "an ass groper in Germany." Or the multiple examples of Black Americans who've been killed by the police just this year, pictured here, and the growing Black Lives Matter movement, which is challenging, among other things, how Black Americans are never fully seen as American, and this is already reverberating and connecting to global movements against racism and police violence, including in France, as the example of Assa Traoré shows. In this sense, we should consider suspect citizenship as a clarion call for all marginalized populations globally, especially those populations racialized as Black. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. That was wonderful. Very, very awesome. We will now, I think, open it up for questions, but if people would want to put their question in the chat or acknowledge, let me know that you have a question. I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask Jean a question directly. So I think that's how we'll proceed.
Should I stop sharing my screen, or does it matter?
I don't think it matters, but you can stop if you want.
Okay.
I want people to jot down your email address at any moment. So Parisa, is it?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Beaman, for this incredibly powerful and important work that you're sharing with us. Throughout your research, I guess, and in this time, have you kind of pondered or figured out why there's this resistance to acknowledge the racism inherent, in this kind of Islamophobic rhetoric that's going on in France? Because I feel like the current scholarship, it points to Islamophobia and religion being the main issue in Europe versus racism really being an American issue. Coincidentally, my work is, looks at how religion actually is a source of discrimination in the US as well, and it's not removed from race. They are tied together. So your work speaks so directly to what I'm pursuing as well. So I appreciate it so much. Why do you think there's this resistance to admit how inherently racism is imbued in that Islamophobia or anti-Christian, non-Christian, non-whiteness?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. And I would love to hear more about your work at another juncture. So I would say part of it is that it goes directly against what Republican values are. And so I think it's hard to overstate the role of Republican ideology in sort of anything I've said I guess during my career. So to say that like, you know, the ways, and I think it's really helpful to think about the ways in which Islam is framed very deliberately as counter to French values, European values, Enlightenment values. And so therefore, of course, that's the thing you're going to target. And it's interesting to like think about this talk and sort of your question in light of what's been going on in France just this week in terms of like Macron's insistence on sort of, you know, fighting against Islam because that's the sort of threat. And I think it's like that's the thing that's being framed as counter to what French is. And so in that sense, the question of racism is sort of irrelevant or completely not consequential because the real danger is Islam or in sort of the Islamic separatism specifically. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, you have a question?
Myself, okay. Hi, Jean.
Hi, Richard.
Wonderful to have you here and to hear you speak on your book and your new research. So, as somebody who somewhat follows things in France, I have a sort of, I have a question that I want to use to provoke you a bit, I guess. And
oh yeah,
you know, so
let's go there.
Yeah, let's go there. So, you know, building on the previous comments. So, you know, in the groups that you're looking at, there is in fact this kind of, you know, fusion of anti-Islam and also racist prejudice. But one of the surprises, to me at least, in the Trajectoire et Origine study, and for those of you who don't know France, this is a large-scale study of the second generation in France, is the relatively high level of partnering on the part of the second generation Maghrébin with Français de souche, as you call them, or you know, people whose roots are entirely in France. And I wondered if in the course of your ethnographic research, you've encountered these kinds of partnerships. And, you know, I mean, of course, just because you marry somebody who's white, it doesn't mean that you're really, obviously, it doesn't mean that you're fully accepted. But have you, you know, what are your conclusions about this intermarriage and interpartnering?
Oh, that's it. Okay, so you're asking me about sort of my perceptions of intermarriage specifically, or just any kind of cooperation?
No, I meant sort of forming families, whether marriage or not, right? Between majority and minorities. So.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for clarification because I was about to go somewhere totally different. Yeah, thanks for the question. So, you know, I think it's interesting because I think in some ways from my first book or just, you know, sort of my ongoing research, people who are involved or sort of partner with or have children with or all of the above with white individuals tend to see themselves as sort of being more exemplifying of what French Republicanism is, right? And so they're not thinking about these strict sort of racial and ethnic distinctions, right? So they're sort of thinking about their social networks, their friendship networks, their romantic partnerships, what have you, outside of these, like, you know, I guess what I would say as these sort of racial and ethnic lines, but it doesn't actually mitigate how they themselves are treated, right? And so I think it's always a tension between are treated as sort of Maghrébin or individuals. So I think it's always a tension of sort of how they see themselves in French society as sort of, you know, operate in ways that are very much aligned with French Republicanism versus how they think that other French people see them and treat them, and not in the fact that they don't treat them differently just because they're partnered with a white person or have, you know, white kids, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Anyone else?
Can I ask a question?
Who are you?
I'm from Duke.
Who's sorry, but
my name appears. I see my name appearing.
Oh, hi. Hi, Ms. Julian. Hi. It's nice to see you.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was intrigued, not intrigued. Your hypothesis or that you're focusing on the impact of state violence as sort of the sort of kind of independent variable that is sort of causing that kind of outsiderness of these subjects. within France. Is that it? Am I right in thinking so?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So I was wondering, the examples you gave suggest that it operates outside of state institutions, that the idea of state violence seems to suggest a kind of institutional analysis that you're pursuing. But the examples that you provide seem to suggest that there's certainly a quotidian, deep quotidian entrenchment of this particular state expression, if you will. And it suggests that there's a sense in which that kind of outsiderness, that performance of outsiderness by everyday French citizens, has sort of taken root and has a life that seems to exist outside of state institutionalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that there's what seems to be what's suggestive here is that there's a certain kind of a link that seems to be missing somewhat, that there's a stage there or step there or link there, articulation of the way in which, you know, this institutionalism is an expression of a sovereignty that gets embedded, that has got embedded within the commonsensical patterns of French citizens, if you will, white French citizens, if you will. So I was wondering if you might want to go there a bit in discussing that.
Yeah, thanks for that provocation, and maybe we can talk a little bit more offline about that. So I don't know if I think that I'm necessarily, so I guess when I say state violence, I guess I'm wanting to pay attention to the ways in which like everyday actors are imbuing the sort of logics of the state. And so in that sense, it's sort of like a way to sort of indict, to indict like individual police officers as representing a particular violence of the state. And I guess I don't know. Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to think about like, so a couple different thoughts. I guess I'm trying to think about how like the police, partly because France is such a centralized society, among other things, the police are sort of, you know, agents literally and figuratively of the state, and then individual police officers through these sort of like police stops are sort of imbuing a particular logic of the state. And sort of then I'm focusing on kind of how individuals in these like very brief kind of interactions are like responding to that or mobilizing against that kind of state violence. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about this sort of sovereignty questions. I don't want to necessarily make a distinction so much between like a sort of institutional analysis and a more sort of like interpersonal or interactional analysis. But I'm not sure if that's got at what you were gesturing towards.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, I'm wondering whether you're also thinking about the questions that arise in the U.S.
Yeah.
If you're not in terms of, you know, the sort of handshake thing, why is there not this when there is this in the U.S., but how might the expressions of racialization tell us something about not France, but France as an expression of a kind of, if you will, global anti-Blackness that has a specific kind of style and expression there, but it's manifest here differently, but there's a certain kind of connection, articulation, sort of. When you write these things, are you also thinking about how it is exhibited here in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a couple of thoughts on that. So one, I think I'm always sort of like wrestling with this tension between talking about the sort of particularities of France, but then also talking about what's like sort of general and global and, you know, sort of present in other spaces in other ways. So that's both like my sort of tension as a writer or, you know, author or whatever, but also actually I think what activists themselves that I'm studying with this court stuff are wrestling through too, because they're making connections between what's happening, the state violence that's happening in France with, you know, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Brazil, what's happening, you know, anywhere there's a Black person, right? But also sort of doing that simultaneously, or managing that, doing that simultaneously while talking about what's particular about the French context. And so I think that's kind of both like my, I don't know, line I try to toe in my own work, but then also what I think the activists themselves are doing as they're trying to make sense of what's happening very locally, but also what's happening globally in this sort of, you know, especially in this sort of global mobilization, if you will, against racism and violence. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Leslie, do you want to go next? And then I see a hand raised, Georges Fouron. We can go after Leslie. Go right ahead, Leslie.
Okay, thanks, Jean.
Thanks, Leslie.
I think I have a question that's kind of related to the last one a little bit. And it's really general because I don't know this area of research very well, but I'm just curious about your sense of how these movements are embedded in other movements, sort of other kind of quasi-left movements, and the extent to which that has shifted at all over time. I mean, my reference point is kind of the feminist literature on the veil, and how, you know, there's been, you know, a very different sort of coalitional framework there than, again, you know, I don't want to put this necessarily in comparative framework, but I know that there's been a lot of discussion about different ways of thinking about that issue that might create and foreclose different kinds of coalitions, if I can put it in the most abstract sort of way. So I'm curious about the similarities, or, you know, or the way the movements that you're studying are embedded in broader coalitions or not, you know, that is distinctive in France. And also, I guess, since you've been studying this topic for a while, whether you think there's been any shifts, you know, over time in those kinds of coalitions, or maybe
thanks for the
across issues, or maybe differences across issues that might, you know, different kinds of coalitional movements.
Okay, thanks for the question. Yeah, so so one of the ways I'm thinking about this is sort of thinking about sort of how the movement against police violence is very much in conversation with and sometimes in response to a broader left movement in France, right? And sort of a broader sort of critique of the state on, you know, historically speaking, leftist mobilizations. And so one of the ways that this has come up more recently is in the ongoing Gilets jaunes or yellow vest movement, in which, you know, there's some alliance between some of the people I've talked about in this talk, and then also some sort of active distancing from those activists, partly because they see them as getting more attention and more sort of respect, for lack of a better word. Oh, I think someone's not muted.
You just done?
So one of the ways that this plays out with the yellow vest movement, which I think is really interesting, is that some of the activists I've talked about are very intentional about drawing alliances and being very public about those alliances, partly to get the same kind of attention or media attention that the yellow vest movement and the Gilets jaunes movement is getting. But then on the other side of that, there's been increased attention among some of these white Gilets jaunes activists to the sort of broader issues of police violence. So there's a lot of sort of discourses at demonstrations, for example, that I've attended, in which people will say something to the effect of, I had no idea that police violence was such an issue until I was, you know, part of this Gilets jaunes movement, and the police, you know, like poked out my eye or something like that. I mean, that's not a joke, but anyway. But yeah, like, so I think that's another way of thinking about how there's sort of a simultaneous kind of like how to elevate or police violence as a structural issue outside of these particular communities, these particular banlieues that I've talked about. So I think that like a lot of the anti-police violence activists are really trying to do that work to sort of indict the state as a whole as sort of being the sort of creator and perpetrator of this violence. Yeah. Thank you.
Georges Fouron, would you like to ask Jean a question?
Yes, I am Georges Fouron. I'm a professor.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you. I'm a professor at Stony Brook University, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. But I'd like to shift the direction of the discussion to another perspective. I do research on transnational identity. In other words, I study the reconnection that immigrants from the Caribbean try to reestablish with the country of origin when they feel like they're not accepted in America because they are Black, because they are poor, because et cetera, et cetera. Now in France, these immigrants from Africa, from North Africa and West Africa, the former colonial establishments, they find it very hard to be accepted, to be integrated, quote unquote, into French society. Did you observe any attempt to see the country of origin, either in the short term or in the long term, as an alternative to mitigate the issues they are facing in France?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, absolutely. Some of my respondents felt like they had no choice but to eventually resettle in Morocco or Algeria or what have you, partly because they'd sort of done everything that they could to actually be incorporated in French society and still don't feel fully incorporated. So that was something that many of my respondents referenced, like whether or not they'll actually do that is a different conversation. But also my respondents referenced not just sort of moving back to the Maghreb, but also sort of thinking about moving to like the UK or even the US, the places that they see as more sort of acceptable or accepting of them. So that was another thing that was floated as well. Thanks for the question.
We have someone named Zegrari who has asked a question in the chat. Would you like to unmute to elaborate further on what you're asking here? Zegrari, are you out there?
No pressure, yeah.
No pressure. Well, the question reads, what about the social roots of ghettoization and the colonial past? I don't know if that's a full enough question to decipher.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would say to the colonial past part, I'm not sure I fully get the question, but I'll just say that I think part of what's I'm trying to think through presently is how a lot of the dynamics in the colonial empire are sort of reproduced in contemporary France. And so police violence is one way to think about that. So I think, that's me saying this, but I also think that like my respondents, the activists that I've done interviews with are very clear about saying how this police violence is not something that's new, but it's something that's directly stems from the violence during, Algerian, during the colonialism of Algeria and other regions as well. The social roots of ghettoization, I'm not sure what that necessarily gets at, but maybe, yeah, I don't know. So I don't know if that sort of relates to maybe the different banlieue communities. I'm sorry if that's not actually relevant to, if that wasn't the question, but I guess then I can also just say that's directly related to the colonial past, was of course like, former immigrants from former French colonies moved to the metropole, predominantly were settling in these banlieue communities. And so I think that might be the ghettoization that the question might be referring to. Thank you. And hopefully that answered that question.
Okay, Christopher Maggio, would you like to ask Jean a question?
Good. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm a PhD candidate here at CUNY. I just had a quick question. So do you have any reflections on sort of the different experiences, for instance, of like North Africans and West Africans in terms of their experiences of racialization, how they are perceived, and they feel they're perceived in society, if there's any, sort of like collaboration? I mean, obviously there are, but how that kind of plays out, or if there are conflicts, or there's different ways in which they see themselves in this position, or or like I said, cause, if you had any reflections on that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, a lot of thoughts on that. So, I mean, my first book was just about children of the Maghreb origin population. So, I can't speak, so when I was doing that research and I was asking them, they were very clear that they were on the lowest rung of the racial order in France, right? And then in my ongoing work with, focusing on police violence that I talked about, when I interview people of origins of West Africa, they'll say the same thing in reverse, that they're the worst people, they're the worst treated in the racial order. So just to give you kind of a sense that everyone thinks that each group thinks that they're treated worse than the other group. But I think, so that's one answer. I think the other thing though is that, I think part of your question also makes me think about the ways in which the experiences of being racialized in France actually bring together the two groups, even though they have very different migrant histories and trajectories. And so there's sort of this almost sort of pan-Black category that's being created in France as a result of the sort of state violence and racism that I discussed. So that's sort of an interesting way of thinking about how the distinctions, I mean, even though the migratory distinctions are clear, the sort of actual experiences of being racialized as Black in France society sort of creates this kind of other pan-ethnic group, which I think is also kind of what's happening.
Thank you, that's really interesting.
Thank you for the question.
I received a private message from Dalia Youssef, one of our IMS students. Dalia, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Jean a question? Dalia, you out there?
Sorry again. Hi everyone again. Thank you, Dr. Jean. So what I was saying is that what's very interesting about Citizen Outsider is, in addition to bringing race to the discussion, is also bringing class. And there's actually this general comparison between American Muslims and French Muslims, that there's this kind of, okay, American Muslims, they lessen or better their status of integration because of their education background, socioeconomic background compared to French Muslims, for instance. So have you noticed whether the issue of class difference within the North African communities and Muslim communities in France, actually, or there any kind of differences that you notice of their self-image, or the kind of model of citizenship that they have, for instance, or live in? And the other question, and I know that you discussed, of course, a social movement and activism, but there's also this comparison between the civil rights movement in the US, for instance, and how Cassie Schneider book, it's in your references, between the urban rights between Paris and city. And she compared that you don't have this kind of historical movement in France. And even in the 60s, the student and youth movement, they weren't the component of race wasn't there, and also the immigrant rights. So do you think by trying to be integrated in a kind of larger movement, larger social movements, immigrants and minorities can have better chance, given the model of secularism, for instance, which is very unique when it comes to the French state? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So just to clarify, you're asking me sort of, so do I think that sort of what are the sort of advantages or impact of people's Muslims' involvement in these social movements in France? Is that?
Yeah, that this will a little bit better their situation when it comes to integration, political participation, rather than focusing on cultural talk.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting question. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily think there's sort of advantages in terms of sort of their ability to be seen as fully integrated or incorporated into French society. Rather, I see it as sort of or I think they see it as more sort of their only kind of resort, given the sort of mistreatment that they continually experience. So I don't know. I mean, I have to think a little bit more about that. I don't know if I think of it so much as sort of they're thinking about kind of what are the actual outcomes that might come about by sort of being involved in these movements. And then to your other, so that was thanks.
Sorry, the class dimension.
The class dimension. Yes. Sorry. Yeah, so what's really interesting about that as it relates to French Muslims is it very similar to kind of what we might think about the discourse of, middle-class minorities here in the States, which is that, even this is true for my the plurality of my respondents, is that even though they were middle class, they still had, parents that are working class or brothers or sisters that were working class. So the sort of distance, if you will, between sort of their class status was not that far removed from that of their parents, of their family members. So in that sense, they were still very much incorporated with a sort of working class kind of, I don't know, sensibility, for lack of a better word, even though they themselves were well educated and had professional kinds of jobs and those sorts of things. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I commented in the chat box only because Dahlia's question made me think of, something that I don't know if it's been written about, but certainly your work opens the conversation, Professor Beaman, that the racism in France is not only towards Black immigrants or Muslim immigrants, it's also directed at Asian tourists. I mean, they hate Asian tourists to the point where they literally, say, oh, don't get that anymore. All the Chinese are coming and getting. I mean, it's in such a derogatory and hateful manner that they treat anyone who's not white, that it's very curious, I find, when the lower SES of certain immigrant groups are going to be associated with, oh, it's not that we don't like them because they're Black, it's just that they're poor and they're bringing things down. Versus the reality, which is that no, you're actually racist towards everyone. It doesn't matter how rich they are. And you don't want to own up to the fact that their SES and their outcomes are actually a byproduct of your racism and not the cause of it. So
yeah. So first, please call me Jean. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think part of sort of saying that, France is a structurally racist society towards Black and migrant origin individuals is also to say that it's just deeply a white supremacist society, right? So, and this is, I think, not just true so much about Asian tourists, but I think also just true about the very embedded Chinese community in Paris, for example, so who also sort of face state violence, and there's been incidents of police violence against Chinese residents of Paris. So yeah, absolutely, I completely agree.
I didn't know about that part. Sorry, I apologize. That was just from like anecdotal readings that I had done, from Chinese tourists, who are on the internet in different forums of like blogs and stuff. And picking that up, I was like, this is insane that this is the rhetoric that's continuing to be perpetuated in scholarship, that this is because they're poor. It's not because they're poor. I mean, the parallels with immigrants in the US, it kind of stems from that same ideology. And I feel like it's erasing what the stem of the issue is, or the root of it.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree. And I think it's helpful to keep in mind sort of the political purposes of doing so, right? Of sort of emphasizing the socioeconomic marginality at the expense of a sort of racial or ethnic one. Yeah, I completely agree.
Thank you. Great. Anybody else have a question?
Yes, can I ask?
Yeah, on that uplifting note, okay. No, go ahead.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Hello? Yes. Thank you, Professor Beaman, for your talk. I am more interested. Yes, I am more interested in the sub-Saharan and the Antillean populations in France as minorities, because that's part of my research, and in that sense also, I am looking mostly at the structural state violence, as from the Republic towards those populations in terms of systemic violence, structural violence, etc. And I know a little bit about Bourdieu's symbolic violence. I was wondering if you see any way that theory could be applied, in looking at those populations in terms of structural violence, or if you have any other references you could probably give me in terms of studying violence in minorities versus dominant-dominate situation.
Yeah, I mean, oh yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so first, I mean, if you email me, I'm happy to send you sort of further notes on that. But I guess the quick thing I'll just say is, I think the symbolic violence is absolutely present in sort of the construction of, among other things, the French educational system, right? So part of what I talked about in my book is how many of my respondents learn kind of what it means to be French and how they're excluded from those definitions in, you know, the public schooling process. And so like the sort of learning what French history is, but not learning about France's history of slavery or colonialism sort of serves that role. So yeah, I think in that sense, I definitely see the symbolic violence is present. Yeah.
Yes, but also in terms of the police, you know, the authority of the police to check, you know, the identity,
yeah,
the performative violence, etc. You know, invested in certain.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I'm less inclined to think about that in this context of symbolic violence, because I think the violence is very literal. So I sort of see where you're coming from, but I sort of struggle with that framing of it. Yeah.
Yeah, the idea that, you know, is what they call the control de faciès, which are like
the control identity. The
identity profiling, etc. So I mean, like if police stop in you and call you and ask you for your ID, so you have this authority that you have to abide, you know, by, and all this. And yeah, so if you have any literature or any any idea, I would love. Yeah. Yes, I'm looking, because I'm in the middle of my research. Or anyone on the panel. Let's see, I see a lot of sociologists here. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I think I would direct you to Paul Silversine's work, which I cited a bit in this talk. So he does a lot about, he talks about both West Africans and North African origin individuals, and specifically talks a lot about these like control d'identité and sort of how they kind of function as a sort of citizenship surveillance in French society. So I think, his work was great. Yeah.
Thank you. So I had a private message, Natalie Itoke, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Would you like to unmute yourself and
yes, hi Jean.
Hi.
So this is my question. I was wondering, what is your take on conflating discourses on racism in France? Because right now you have issues regarding Islamophobia, and you know, in France, people from the right or even some people from the left will tell you that Islamophobia shouldn't be equated with anti-Muslim racism is not racism, because being a Muslim is not a race, it's a religion.
Right.
So I'd like to get your thought on that, and also the difficulties pertaining to solidarity between, you know, anti-Black racism and anti-Muslim racism, because you also have Black people who happen to be Muslims, and how in France, in many ways, Black people suffer more from anti-Black racism compared to anti-Muslim racism. And people originally from Northern Africa, is mostly this confusion between being Muslim and being Arab. So I just wanted to know if you kind of deconstruct all those nuances that are also kind of very specific to the French take on laicity and race.
Right.
And because it's also part of a process of erasing specificities.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that, for these questions. And I probably won't say anything that you don't know yourself from your own work, but yeah, no, I mean, I think what's really interesting in the work I'm doing now on with these activists is that many of the Black activists are saying, you know, I'm also Muslim, but I'm seen by the police, or I'm stopped by the police because I'm a Black person. But so the problem with, I mean, there's many problems with that, but the issue also with that is, and you know, Maghreb or individuals feel like they have a different kind of state violence, so they're subject to a different state violence, even if Black activists are saying, no, we also suffer from or deal with Islamophobia. We're just not read, you know, on a subway or whatever as a Muslim, as a stereotypical Muslim person. We're read as a Black person, and that's enough for the police officer to stop us. But you know, that doesn't mean that we're not also sort of continually dealing with issues of Islamophobia. And that sort of gets at a little bit of the question of sort of solidarities around these different issues, because and it's kind of something I'm still sort of thinking through. This is a very tentative answer, but you know, it's been interesting to witness how some Maghreban origin activists are diplomatically, somewhat reluctant to be in solidarity with Black activists, partly I think for the issues that you raise around sort of like, you know, who's more targeted by the police, who is more harmed by, you know, I mean, even this week, Macron's discourses on Islam or the dangers of Islam, who's sort of seen as a visible sort of reminder of the presence of Islam. I think, so I think partly that's what's happening. I also think part of it's just sort of a kind of a sort of issue around personalities of different activists, which I think happens with every social movement. But yeah, so no, I think part of it is also sort of, you know, when, especially now, like really just this week or the past couple of weeks, with what's been happening in France, with what Macron has said, et cetera, I think there's a way in which like migrant or individuals see themselves as more sort of visible targets of the state in that way, that, you know, Black activists who are Muslim are also targets, but they're not sort of, they're not visibly seen that way. And I think that gets at, yeah, so that's that kind of stickiness of a solidarity across the groups that I'm trying to kind of think through, and I guess they're thinking through as a movement live in progress. But more generally, I mean, I think, you know, I mean, yeah, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I think there's a sort of way in which Islamophobia continues to be used as a way to talk about this sort of catch-all other category. And I think that that's only, you know, gotten worse since I've done this kind of work. So I think that like part of the way that racism becomes legible or visible in France is through this discourse of, or this idea of Islamophobia, or this fear of a sort of Islamatist separatism, or whatever Macron said a week ago or something like that. So yeah, thank you for those questions and provocations.
Thank you very much. Pierre has put a message in the chat. I don't know if Pierre wants to ask it, read it, elaborate. It says, thanks for this interesting discussion. Adding to what was just said, I guess we could say that white French are unable to consider any non-white culture from being worthy of respect and equal to their own. The creation of a cultural hierarchy implies that non-white French must renounce their heritage and embrace the true French way, i.e. total assimilation. Out of the many one in the US becomes not many, but one in France. Pierre, I don't know if you want to elaborate, or Jean, if you want to just reply to that comment.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, oh, okay.
Sorry, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I just thought I should put it in the chat because I wasn't sure how to frame it correctly in words on the spot. So.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I don't really have anything to add. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, Noura and Bobby just requested to speak.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk, Professor Beaman. A comparison came to my mind, and I don't know if it's appropriate at all, but I was just thinking about the status of the citizenship of Muslims in India and how it's also held very suspect. And I was just thinking about how much colonialism is haunting this kind of suspect citizenship in France too, given that a lot of the resentment towards Indian Muslims is that they kind of, they found an out from the caste system by converting, not just actually Muslims, but also Indian Christians. And so I was wondering, this is a very basic question, but how much colonialism or imperialism is haunting this kind of phenomenon in France?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think I would first suggest the research or the book of Farid, who's, I'm blanking on the name of the book, but it's a great book, comparing sort of some of these issues that you laid out between of Muslims in France and India. But yeah, I mean, I think, I think everything that sort of happens in France and sort of what I'm talking about in this talk and just work in general is absolutely a sort of reflection of France's colonial empire. And relatedly, I think a reflection of the sort of denial or disavow of this like very ugly colonial history, right? I think that like we're constantly seeing reverberations of that in all of these sort of recent events that have happened in France, you know, in the last decade or so that I've been doing this work. So I think there's always this sort of my colleague here, Farid Gordon, has this idea of like a haunting of race in particular ways. And I think it's like a similar kind of thing that's happening. I mean, she wasn't talking about France, but there's a similar thing that happens, I think, here. There's like a sort of haunting of colonialism that is always present and always imbued in everything that's happened. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think it's not just the sort of colonial history, but also the sort of ignorance or just like continued ignoring of that colonial history. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question? Well, I'll ask a question, Jean, a bit of a different one. We have a lot of students in this talk who are at different levels, who are different points in their career, at different points in their research. And I was wondering if you can just speak a little bit more generally, more methodologically about the assets and challenges you've faced in your work, you've used in your work or faced in your work, especially conducting international field work. I'm also curious how the questions for your current project emerged from your work for the research you conducted for the book. And out of curiosity, how have your current participants reacted to your findings from your original project, your original book? Have you discussed it with them? Have you had any sort of dialogue with them about that? And what are some of their reactions to it as you're studying this group now?
Okay, so that's 3 questions to be technical.
It is.
So just, making sure we're counting the same way. Yeah, no, thanks. I'll just take it in reverse order. So yeah, I mean, I'm still in touch with a lot of my respondents, as friends, or at least friends, how they see me. But so I've sort of talked to them about how the research is going, and I've sent some of them speak English and then can read. I've not published in French. I can read parts of it, and so I've gotten feedback informally that way. So that's great. And then I, when I go to France, outside of a global pandemic, I'm able to reconnect with a lot of those folks. And so that kind of ties into sort of the current research question and how I kind of got there. So basically what happened was that I was doing copy edits for this book, and I just happened to sort of read about the case of Adama Traoré in 2016, and just got kind of interested in that, and sort of ended up kind of talking to some of the people I had interviewed for my book kind of about that, and just sort of police violence in sort of a very casual kind of way. Not casual about police violence, but yeah, and then I just sort of went down that rabbit hole because I sort of realized I was kind of I had sort of been interested in kind of how race is marked in the context in which there are state categories. But then I sort of thought about, like, well, how do people like engage in anti-racist struggle in the context in which there are categories? So I sort of went down that rabbit hole, and I guess I'm still going down that rabbit hole. So it sort of came out of just my general like curiosity about how people fight against racism, and then I sort of got more interested in police violence specifically. And then I think it's also sort of relates to like just personally my interest in state violence as a Black person who's so just sort of dovetails into all of that stuff. Methodologically, I guess methodology. Yeah, so I think just to kind of answer this, I'll just say that like I kind of came to this topic sort of through a biographical interest, and which is that I've been speaking French since I was in middle school, and so I just did a study abroad program as an undergrad, and lived with a French family for a year, a white French family, and then just my experience as being African American that I won't bore you with, but nonetheless were very similar to my experiences of being similar and different in some ways of being racialized here in the States. And so that kind of got me curious about, like, in a very broad sense, what is it like to be a racial and ethnic minority in France? And then, years later, when I was in grad school at Northwestern, I started thinking about it more systematically. So I guess I also like to share that to say that I think it's, I usually tell grad students, like, it's really important to do work that you're like passionate in yourself. Because I think if I had been looking for a quote unquote sexy topic, I don't think I would have picked this. I think I would have picked something that's a little, I don't know what the hell I would have picked, I'm not gonna guess. But like, but yeah, like I think, so part of what like continues to motivate me is my sort of just general fascination with French society that's just now been like over 20 years. And so that kind of was what helped me figure out how to approach this research and come from that place, because that really is like a genuine, that was a genuine curiosity of mine. And that really, yeah, and then the sort of sociology part kind of like came after my general sort of obsession, I guess, with the French society. So yeah, I guess I'll stop.
Great, thank you. So we have 8 minutes left. We have one more question from Helen Marrow, who had to leave, but she can watch this, watch the response later when we are able to publish the video. She says she was very excited about your new interdisciplinary seminar that looks at art and media too. She teaches a course on immigration, politics, and media, and beyond studies of how media depicts immigrants. Students always want to know how immigrants both respond to media depictions of themselves and or use ethnic media to change narratives and fight for rights. So she's curious how media plays into your study and case.
Oh, thanks, Helen. And so Helen's referring to this mailing grant I got with some colleagues here. So it's like hot off the presses. So thank you for, reading my newsletter. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, yeah, so that's a great question. It's kind of something I'm trying to think through with this collaborative thing I'm going to do at some point. Basically, yeah, I guess the short answer I can give to this though is that minorities are very conscious of sort of who gets represented in sort of French media or media that's sent out. And specifically, even representations of like the banlieues as a sort of like dangerous, scary place. Like people are very attentive to that. And sort of, I think, and I found that a lot when I was doing my fieldwork that, many of my respondents wanted to like make sure I wasn't like, I don't know, indoctrinated with these very problematic images of different banlieue communities. So that's sort of just a quick answer to something we can talk about longer later. Thanks. Thank you.
Great. Sorry, Helen, I saw that you're still here. But... should have checked. Okay, so we have 6 more minutes if anybody has any other questions or thoughts.
Jean. I've always wondered, fascinating work, and I'm so excited for you in terms of your new project, although I also love the book, which is so interesting in so many ways. One question I've always wanted to ask you, but never had a chance to, is which ethnic group in the US context would you equate roughly with the experience of North Africans in France? On the one hand, they seem to do quite well in terms of some, not all, objective measures like educational attainment, but they are obviously deeply marginalized, as you have made very clear throughout the book and throughout this talk as well. And I'm struggling to think which group would that be, and if so, what are the analytical similarities and differences that shape the experiences across the Atlantic for those two groups?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So a couple of things. I mean, I think, okay, so yeah, one kind of response I would say is that a lot of what I brought out in my book is very similar to the experiences of the African-American middle class. And part of the reason why that was sort of very legible to me, it's not, well, obviously not my own identity, but not just my own identity, but also because like Mary Patillo was one of my doctoral advisors. So I was sort of very much like thinking in that way. But, pulling out from that, when I was like writing the book, I was thinking a lot about the experiences of the Latino middle class. I think there's a very similarity. There's a very analogous situation. One in the sense that, individuals themselves can be upwardly mobile compared to the immigrant parents, but nonetheless are still very close to their sort of working class origins, if you will, right? And so that's sort of what it means to be middle class is like demonstratively different for this population as well. And then also I thought, just the experiences of the idea of sort of never being seen as fully American is also very common for my respondents. So this question of sort of where do you really come from, even though they've only lived in France, is also just made me think a lot of the work of, Jody Vallejo at USC on her book on middle class Latinos. I just saw a lot of analogs with this kind of experiences of her respondents and mine in that sense, yeah.
That is so fascinating that you went to the Latino middle class, because I was thinking about the West Indians, for example, and what who are extremely, accomplished in terms of, again, educationally speaking. Nigerians are probably the model minority, given how high the BA completion rate is among the second generation.
Yeah.
Higher than actually Chinese or Indians, for that matter.
Yeah.
So I think
that's it. Oh.
And just a footnote to this, Jean, as you talk about the kind of experiences of, never feeling completely belonging, I would even say Chinese is an analogy, because obviously they're extremely successful in some measures, but because of the racial triangulation, the Claire Kim's concept, right? Chinese are often seen as the outsider and forever foreign. So I think in so many ways, your story resonates with sort of many, many groups from different racial backgrounds who have made it in terms of the middle class status, but never quite felt belong.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I agree with what you said. The only reason why I didn't pull those examples out as analogies is I don't think there's the same discourse of a sort of of Maghreb second generation middle class as a quote unquote model minority, like in France. So that's sort of like they have the perpetual foreigner dynamic, but there isn't a sort of like they're being held relative to other, or held up relative to other racial and ethnic minority groups. You see what I'm saying? So that was kind of like the, yeah.
I would refrain from speaking more because they're drilling right outside my wall.
Okay, thank you. But thank you for the questions. Yeah.
All right, well, with 2 minutes left, unless we have any last minute questions, I think we will end it there. I want to thank Jean Beaman for joining us today. That was wonderful. That was
Thank
lovely.
You so much for having me. I really enjoyed
our
it.
immigrant seminar series. Thank you all for coming again. Hope you enjoy your weekends and your holiday next week. And we will be having our final events in the Immigrant Seminar Series on December 11th, same time at 3 o'clock. Please check out the Immigrant Seminar Series websites and the International Migration Studies website for Zoom details and registration. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your great questions.